Rain lashed against the marble steps of the Kensington estate as heavy oak doors slammed shut, severing a 5-year marriage in an instant. Penniless, stripped of her coat, and framed for a betrayal she never committed, the ousted daughter-in-law had exactly 1 hour before her husband's private security dragged her away for good. With frozen fingers, she pulled an ancient cracked cell phone from the lining of her torn bag and typed 9 words to the most dangerous man in Chicago. The heavy custom-forged oak doors of the Kensington mansion shut with a finality that echoed louder than the thunder rolling across the Chicago skyline. Beatrice stood on the sprawling limestone porch, the torrential rain instantly soaking through her thin silk evening gown. She didn't shiver from the cold, not yet. The shock running through her veins was too blinding, too absolute. Less than 20 minutes ago, she had been sitting at a dining table adorned with baccarat crystal and imported white truffles. It was supposed to be a celebratory dinner for Kensington Global's third-quarter earnings. Mayor Harrison had been seated to her left, Senator Montgomery to her right. Then her mother-in-law Margaret Kensington had gently tapped a silver spoon against her champagne flute. Beatrice closed her eyes, the rain plastering her dark hair to her cheeks as the memory replayed with agonizing clarity. Margaret's voice, cultured and laced with venom, had silenced the room. It is with a heavy heart that the Kensington family must address a rot within our own walls. Margaret had announced her gaze, locking onto Beatrice like a predator. Before Beatrice could even process the words, a thick manila folder was tossed onto the center of the table. Glossy photographs spilled out, dozens of them. They showed Beatrice in compromising positions with Thomas, the family's newly hired chauffeur. They were doctored, brilliant, seamless, expensive deepfakes. Beatrice had looked wildly to her husband, Arlo, expecting him to leap to her defense. Instead, Arlo kept his eyes fixed on his plate, his jaw tight. Sitting directly across from him was Victoria Carmichael, the heiress to the Carmichael shipping empire. Victoria had offered Arlo a sympathetic, tragic smile, but Beatrice saw the triumphant gleam in the other woman's eyes. Her hand was resting conspicuously on her slightly rounded stomach. In an instant, the puzzle pieces snapped together. Arlo had gotten Victoria pregnant. A divorce would cost Arlo half his shares in Kensington Global, due to the ironclad prenup Beatrice had negotiated when they were young and in love. But an annulment based on infidelity, a morality clause breach that left Beatrice with absolutely nothing. "You're framing me," Beatrice had whispered, her voice trembling as the high society guests gasped in feigned horror. "Get this whore out of my house," Margaret had ordered coldly, not even deigning to look at Beatrice anymore. Security had descended instantly. They didn't let her pack a bag. They didn't let her retrieve her coat or her actual cell phone. Margaret's head of security, a hulking ex-military brute named Gregory, had gripped her arms tight enough to leave bruises, dragging her through the sprawling foyer. They tossed her old frayed leather handbag, the one she had kept from before her marriage, at her chest and shoved her out into the storm. "Your accounts are frozen, Mrs. Kensington," Gregory had sneered before the doors closed. "If you try to contact the press, the legal team will bury you. If you show up here again, I'll personally make sure you're committed to a psychiatric facility. Walk away." Now, standing in the deluge, Beatrice looked down at her bare arms, covered in goosebumps. The Kensington estate sat in the heart of the Gold Coast. The nearest public transit was miles away, and the storm was escalating into a severe squall. She began to walk. The thin soles of her designer heels slipped on the wet cobblestones, sending her crashing to her knees. The sharp pain radiated up her legs, but she forced herself to stand. She had no money, no phone, no family left to call. Her parents had passed away shortly after her wedding, and her supposed friends were entirely composed of Margaret Kensington's social circle women who would block her at the first whisper of scandal. Every step she took away from the estate felt like stepping into an abyss. 5 years of devotion, of swallowing Margaret's veiled insults, of supporting Arlo through his panic attacks and corporate failures, erased in 10 minutes. They hadn't just kicked her out, they had orchestrated her absolute destruction. By tomorrow morning, the society papers would brand her a cheating gold digger. She would never work in this city again. A violent gust of wind nearly knocked her over, forcing her to seek refuge. 3 blocks down, the manicured mansions gave way to a commercial district. Through the sheets of rain, a flickering neon sign hummed a sickly pink light. Patsy's Diner. Open 24 hours. Beatrice pushed through the rusted glass door. The bell jingled weakly. The diner smelled of stale coffee, old grease and damp wool. It was completely empty, save for an elderly man wiping down the counter. "Kitchen's closed, lady. Just coffee and pie." The man grunted, not looking up until he heard the squelch of her ruined shoes. He paused, taking in her soaked, expensive gown, her ruined makeup, and the desperate, hollow look in her eyes. "You okay?" "Just a coffee, please," Beatrice whispered, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form the words. She slid onto a cracked vinyl stool, clutching her old leather bag to her chest, as if it were a life preserver. As the diner owner poured a steaming mug, Beatrice fumbled with the zipper of her bag. She needed to think. She needed a lawyer. She reached into the side pocket, hoping against hope she had left a forgotten $20 bill inside. Her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic, tucked deep within the torn silk lining. Beatrice froze. Her breath hitched in her throat. She slowly withdrew her hand. Resting in her palm was a heavy, outdated black burner phone. The heavy plastic of the burner phone felt foreign, yet intimately familiar in Beatrice's trembling hands. The diner owner, a man whose name tag read Saul, slid the ceramic mug of coffee across the linoleum counter. $3, Sal said, his eyes narrowing at her shivering form. Beatrice didn't hear him. The roaring in her ears drowned out the hum of the diner's refrigerators. She stared at the black phone, the memories from 5 years ago, flooding back with terrifying clarity. Before the Kensington wealth, before the galas and the designer gowns, Beatrice had been an emergency room trauma nurse at Cook County Memorial. She worked the graveyard shift, the hours where the city bled the most. One freezing November night, she had been walking to her apartment after a grueling 14-hour shift. In the narrow, trash-strewn alleyway behind her building, she had heard a wet, rattling cough. She had found a man slumped against the brick wall, dressed in a bespoke suit that was ruined by the heavy arterial blood soaking his side. He had 2 bullet wounds, one in the shoulder, one in the abdomen. "Hospital!" she had gasped, reaching for her phone. But the man's hand, as fast as a striking snake, had grabbed her wrist. His grip was astonishingly strong for someone bleeding out. "No hospitals, no cops," he had rasped, his dark eyes burning into hers with a terrifying, absolute authority. "You're wearing scrubs. Fix me." Any sane person would have run. But Beatrice was bound by her oath, and something in the man's feral, desperate gaze made her stay. She had half dragged, half carried him up the 3 flights of stairs to her cramped apartment. For 6 hours she had worked on her dining table, digging the slugs out of his flesh with sterilized tweezers, suturing his torn muscles and pumping him full of stolen broad-spectrum antibiotics. He didn't scream once. He just watched her. He stayed in her apartment for 3 days to stabilize. He told her his name was Dominic. Just Dominic. On the 4th morning, Beatrice woke up to find the apartment empty. The blood-stained sheets were folded neatly. On her kitchen counter sat a stack of banded $100 bills, enough to pay off her entire student loan debt, and a cheap black burner phone. Beneath the phone was a note written in sharp, aggressive handwriting. There is one number programmed in this phone. If the world ever corners you, press call. We are even, but I pay my debts. 2 weeks later, she saw his face on the front page of the Chicago Tribune. Dominic Russo, the newly ascended head of the Russo Syndicate, the most powerful and ruthless organized crime family in the Midwest, operating behind a massive shadow corporation called Aegis Logistics. She had hidden the phone in the lining of her oldest bag and never touched it again. Until tonight. "Lady," Sal's voice broke through her reverie. He tapped the counter. "I said $3." Beatrice snapped back to the present. She unclasped her purse. I only have a credit card." She pulled out her sleek black titanium Kensington Amex. Sal sighed, pulling a dusty card reader from beneath the counter. He swiped it. The machine beeped angrily. "Declined." Beatrice's stomach plummeted. "Swipe it again, please." Sal swiped. "Declined. Account frozen." "Looks like you're out of luck, sweetheart." Sal said, his tone losing its sympathetic edge. "I run a business, not a charity. If you can't pay, you gotta go back out into the rain." "Please," Beatrice begged, gripping the edge of the counter. "Just give me 10 minutes. I just need to make a call. I have nowhere to go. They took everything." Sal looked at the rain lashing against the windows, then back at Beatrice's desperate face. He let out a gruff sigh. 10 minutes. Drink the coffee. Then you're out." Beatrice wrapped her freezing hands around the hot mug, burning her palms, welcoming the pain to keep her grounded. She set the burner phone on the counter. She pressed the power button. For a terrifying second, the screen remained black. Then, miraculously, a faint blue light flickered to life. The battery icon flashed a dire, flashing red line. 1%. She had seconds. She opened the contacts. There was only one entry, simply labeled D. She didn't press call. She knew Dominic Russo was a man who operated in the shadows, a man whose time was measured in blood and millions. If a stranger answered, or if it went to voicemail, she would be dead in the water. Instead, she opened the text message interface. Her thumbs flew over the keypad, racing against the dying battery. "It's Beatrice. I need you. Patsy's Diner, 4th and Elm." She hit send. The screen showed a small loading circle. Come on. She prayed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The circle vanished. Delivered. The instant the message went through, the phone screen sputtered and died, plunging back into black glass. Beatrice let out a ragged breath, dropping her head into her hands. Now she had to wait. The silence of the diner was oppressive. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Beatrice nursed the cold dregs of her coffee. The adrenaline that had carried her through the expulsion was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion and a creeping sense of terror. What if he didn't remember her? What if he had changed the number? 5 years was a lifetime in the underworld. Dominic Russo was a king now. He probably had a dozen different phones. He was likely sitting in a penthouse, surrounded by guards, laughing at the audacity of a text from a ghost. "All right, lady, time's up," Sal said, grabbing a dirty rag and wiping down the counter, aggressively close to her arms. "Or storm or no storm, you gotta hit the road." Beatrice stood up slowly, her legs trembling. "Thank you for the coffee," she murmured, picking up her ruined bag. She turned toward the glass door, staring out into the pitch-black torrential downpour. She had no destination. She was going to freeze to death on the streets of the city her husband owned. As she reached out to push the door open, the glare of headlights suddenly pierced the darkness outside. Beatrice squinted. 2 heavy blacked-out SUVs had just pulled up to the curb tires, screeching against the wet pavement. But these weren't the sleek, elegant Maybachs associated with high-end wealth. These were brutal armored vehicles. Her heart leapt with a frantic, desperate hope. He came. The doors of the lead SUV swung open, and 4 men stepped out into the rain. Beatrice's fragile hope shattered into a million jagged pieces. She recognized the man leading the pack. It was Gregory, Arlo Kensington's head of security. The diner bell chimed a chaotic, jarring note as Gregory shoved the glass door open, bringing the freezing wind and rain in with him. The 3 men flanking him fanned out immediately, their hands resting casually inside their tailored jackets. They blocked the exits, their faces devoid of any human empathy. Sal, the diner owner, dropped his rag. "Hey, what the hell is this? We're closed." Gregory ignored him completely. His cold, dead eyes locked onto Beatrice, who instinctively took a step back, her spine hitting the edge of the diner counter. "You're a very stupid woman, Beatrice." Gregory said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick, legal-sized document and a silver fountain pen, tossing them onto a nearby booth table. "Mrs. Kensington Senior doesn't like loose ends. Leaving you wandering the streets poses a liability. I have nothing left to give her," Beatrice said, her voice shaking despite her desperate attempt to keep it steady. "She took my home, my husband, my reputation. What else does she want? Your silence, permanently." Gregory sneered. He tapped the document. "This is a full, irrevocable non-disclosure agreement, paired with a confession to the affair and an admission of severe psychiatric distress. You sign this, you get a bus ticket out of Illinois and a monthly stipend of $500, provided you never speak the name Kensington again." Beatrice stared at the paper. It was a complete surrender. A written suicide note for her credibility. "And if I don't sign?" Gregory sighed, feigning disappointment. He gestured to the burly men at the door. "Then we assume your psychiatric distress has made you a danger to yourself. We sedate you, place you in our vehicle, and you spend the next 10 years heavily medicated in a private off-the-grid facility in upstate New York. Your choice." "You can't do this," Beatrice breathed, looking around the empty diner. "This is kidnapping." "In Chicago, the Kensingtons can do whatever they want," Gregory said, taking a step closer. He reached out and grabbed Beatrice by the arm, his thick fingers biting painfully into her bruised flesh. "Sign the paper." "Hey, let her go," Sal yelled, coming out from behind the counter, holding a heavy wooden baseball bat. "I'm calling the cops." One of Gregory's men didn't even blink. He took 2 steps, smoothly, drew a suppressed pistol from his jacket, and pressed the muzzle directly against Sal's forehead. The diner owner froze, all color draining from his face. The bat slipped from his hands, clattering loudly against the linoleum. "Sit down, old man, or you die tonight," the gunman whispered. Sal sank slowly to his knees, raising his hands. Gregory turned his attention back to Beatrice, yanking her violently toward the booth. "No more games. Sign the damn paper, Beatrice. Nobody is coming to save you." Tears of absolute despair finally broke free, mixing with the rainwater on her face. She reached a shaking hand toward the silver pen. Gregory was right. Nobody was coming. The text had been a fool's errand, a fairy tale hope in a nightmare reality. She picked up the pen, the metal cold against her skin. A low, vibrating rumble began to bleed through the diner walls. It started as a deep hum, barely audible over the roaring storm, but within seconds it escalated into a deafening roar. The floorboards of the diner actually vibrated. Gregory frowned, looking toward the front windows. Outside, cutting through the torrential rain, 3 massive black Maybachs slid into the street, completely boxing in the Kensington SUVs. The precision of their arrival was militaristic. Before the vehicles had even fully stopped, the doors flew open in perfect synchronization. 15 men poured out into the street. They didn't look like corporate security. They moved like wolves. They wore dark trench coats, and they didn't bother hiding the heavy automatic weaponry slung across their chests. Within 3 seconds, they had surrounded the Kensington vehicles, dragging Gregory's drivers out by their hair and slamming them face first into the flooded asphalt. "What the?" Gregory breathed, dropping Beatrice's arm and reaching for his own weapon. The front door of the diner was kicked open with such force that the glass pane shattered, showering the entrance in sparkling, deadly rain. The silence that followed was suffocating. The wind howled through the broken frame, but inside the diner nobody dared to breathe. A man stepped through the shattered doorway. He was tall, commanding a terrifying gravity that sucked the oxygen out of the room. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal overcoat, rainwater glistening on his broad shoulders. His dark hair was slicked back, revealing a face composed of sharp, aristocratic angles, and eyes as cold and unforgiving as a frozen ocean. Dominic Russo. He didn't look like the bleeding, desperate man Beatrice had stitched up in her apartment. He looked like the devil himself dressed in bespoke armor. 2 of Dominic's lieutenants stepped in behind him, raising their weapons and locking their sights directly on Gregory and his men. Dominic's cold gaze swept the room. It bypassed the terrified diner owner, bypassed the Kensington goons, and landed squarely on Beatrice. For a fraction of a second, the ice in his eyes thawed, replaced by a dark, burning intensity that made Beatrice's breath catch in her throat. He slowly walked forward. The sound of his leather shoes crunching over the broken glass was the only noise in the room. Gregory, realizing he was entirely outgunned and outclassed, held his hands out, trying to project a confidence he clearly no longer possessed. "Mr. Russo," Gregory said, his voice tight. "This is private Kensington family business. Aegis Logistics has no jurisdiction here. I suggest you walk away before Mayor Harrison—" Dominic didn't stop walking. He didn't even look at Gregory. As he passed the head of security, Dominic casually raised his right hand and backhanded Gregory across the face. The blow was so sudden and devastatingly brutal that it sounded like a gunshot. Gregory, a man who weighed 250 pounds, was lifted entirely off his feet. He crashed backward over a table, shattering it into splinters, blood instantly spraying from his broken jaw. Gregory's 3 men flinched, reaching for their guns. "Move!" Dominic's lieutenant barked, racking the slide of his assault rifle. "And I'll paint this diner with your brains." The Kensington men froze, slowly, raising their hands in surrender. Dominic stepped over Gregory's groaning body and stopped right in front of Beatrice. Up close, she could smell his cologne, cedarwood and rain, mixed with the faint, metallic scent of gunpowder. He looked down at her ruined dress, her bruised arm where Gregory had grabbed her, and the tears staining her cheeks. His jaw tightened, a dangerous muscle ticking in his cheek. Dominic slowly shrugged off his heavy, warm cashmere overcoat. Without a word, he draped it over Beatrice's shivering shoulders, pulling the lapels tight around her neck. The sheer warmth of the fabric, the physical weight of his protection, finally broke the dam inside her. "You came," Beatrice whispered, a sob tearing from her throat. Dominic reached out his large, calloused hand, gently brushing a wet strand of hair from her pale face. His touch was incredibly soft, a jarring contrast to the violence he had just inflicted. "You called," Dominic replied, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He looked over her shoulder at the NDA, resting on the table. He picked up the document, read the first line, and calmly ripped it in half. He turned his dark, lethal gaze back to the Kensington men cowering in the corner. "Tell Margaret and Arlo Kensington," Dominic said softly, though the promise of death echoed in every syllable, "that Beatrice is no longer under their jurisdiction. She belongs to the Russo Syndicate now. And if they ever breathe in her direction again, I will burn Kensington Global to ash and salt the earth it stood on." He looked back down at Beatrice, his expression softening into something fiercely possessive. "Come with me, Beatrice," Dominic said, offering her his hand. "Let's get you home." The interior of the armored Maybach smelled of rich mahogany ozone and Dominic's cedarwood cologne. As the heavy door slammed shut, sealing them inside a soundproof, bullet-resistant cocoon, the howling storm of the Chicago night was instantly muted into a distant hum. Beatrice sank into the plush leather, seating her body finally betraying her. Violent tremors racked her frame, a delayed reaction to the sheer terror of the Kensington estate, the freezing rain, and the explosive violence in the diner. Dominic didn't crowd her. He sat on the opposite side of the spacious cabin, his dark eyes watching her with a predatory, yet fiercely protective intensity. He reached into a crystal console between the seats, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy glass tumbler. "Drink," he commanded, softly pressing the glass into her trembling hands. "It's a 50-year-old Macallan. It will burn the chill out of your blood." Beatrice gripped the glass with both hands and took a desperate swallow. The whiskey was liquid fire, tracing a path of heat down her throat and settling in her stomach, forcing her erratic heartbeat to slow. She looked at the man beside her. 5 years ago, he had been a bleeding, desperate ghost in her cramped apartment. Today he wore power like a second skin. "I didn't think you would come," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I thought you would have forgotten." Dominic let out a low, humorless exhale. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, bringing his face dangerously close to hers. "I have forgotten 1,000 faces in the last 5 years, Beatrice. Yours was never one of them." He reached out his thumb, gently tracing the edge of the dark, rising bruise on her bicep where Gregory had grabbed her. His touch was feather-light, but the sudden darkening of his eyes promised absolute ruin for the man who had caused it. "I promised I would pay my debts. But beyond that, I have kept a very close eye on the Kensington family since the day you married that pathetic excuse for a man. I knew what they were doing to you behind those iron gates." Beatrice stared at him, stunned. "You knew then why?" "Because you chose him," Dominic interrupted gently, the absolute authority in his voice softening. "I rule by force, Beatrice, but I do not force women to stay where they don't want to be. You made a vow to Arlo. I respected your loyalty even if he didn't deserve it. But the second you pressed send on that phone, that vow was severed. You asked for me. Now you have me." The convoy navigated the slick, rain-swept streets with militaristic precision, pulling up 30 minutes later to the private underground garage of the St. Regis, Chicago. Beatrice had attended galas here, but she had never seen this sub-level, heavily guarded by men holding submachine guns who nodded respectfully as Dominic's vehicle rolled past. They took a private elevator that shot up to the 93rd floor. When the doors opened, Beatrice stepped into a sprawling, multi-million-dollar penthouse suspended in the clouds. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree view of the glittering Chicago skyline and the black expanse of Lake Michigan. The decor was minimalist expensive and distinctly masculine, dark slate Italian leather and modern art. A man in a sharp grey suit was waiting in the foyer, holding a medical bag. "This is Dr. Hayes," Dominic said, shrugging off his suit jacket and rolling up his sleeves, revealing faint scars tracing his forearms. "He is on my exclusive payroll. He's going to check your vitals, treat those bruises, and give you something to help you sleep. Lorenzo has prepared the guest suite. There are dry clothes waiting for you." "Dominic," Beatrice said, her voice catching as panic flared again. "They froze everything. My accounts, my credit. I don't even have my passport. They framed me with deepfakes. Tomorrow morning, Margaret will release them to the press. She's going to ruin my life before I can even hire a lawyer." Dominic stopped. He slowly turned around, walking back to her. He took her face in both of his large hands, forcing her to look up into his icy, unwavering gaze. "Listen to me very carefully," he murmured. "Margaret Kensington is a relic playing chess on a board I bought 10 years ago. Do not worry about tomorrow. Take a hot shower. Let the doctor treat you. Sleep. But the press? There will be no press." Dominic stated a terrifying, quiet finality in his tone. "I own the printing presses. I own the servers. I own the city. Go to sleep, Beatrice. When you wake up, the world will look very different." At 6 a.m., the atmosphere inside the Kensington estate on the Gold Coast was suffocatingly tense. Margaret Kensington paced the length of her mahogany-panelled study, her silk robe rustling angrily against the Persian rugs. Arlo sat slouched on a leather Chesterfield sofa, looking pale and thoroughly out of his depth. Across from him sat Victoria Carmichael, sipping herbal tea and looking mildly annoyed by the disruption to her morning routine. "A wired jaw, 2 shattered ribs!" Margaret suddenly screamed, slamming her hand down on her heavy oak desk. "Gregory is lying in the trauma ward at Northwestern Memorial, and my security team was disarmed in 3 seconds by street thugs." "Mother, calm down," Arlo pleaded, rubbing his temples. "It was just a gang. Beatrice must have hired some local muscle from her hospital days." Margaret shot her son a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "Local muscle does not drive armored Maybachs with diplomatic plates, Arlo. Local muscle does not break the jaw of an ex-Navy SEAL with a single backhand." She picked up her phone, dialing her most trusted fixer, a senior partner at a top-tier LaSalle Street law firm. The phone rang once before it was picked up. "Richard," Margaret barked, "I need you to expedite the divorce filings. Send the deepfakes of Beatrice to the Tribune and the Sun-Times immediately. Let's bury her before whoever she hired tries to extort us." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "Margaret," Richard's voice trembled. I can't do that." "Excuse me," Margaret snapped. "I pay your firm $3 million a year in retainers." "Margaret, listen to me." Richard hissed his voice, dropping to a terrified whisper. 15 minutes ago, every single digital copy of those photographs vanished from our encrypted servers. Not just deleted, the hard drives were wiped with military-grade overwriting software. And my managing partner just received a visit at his home in Lake Forest. A visit from whom? Margaret demanded, her blood running cold. "Aegis Logistics," Richard whispered. "Margaret, do you have any idea who you provoked? Aegis is a front. It's the Russo syndicate. Dominic Russo personally ordered the visit. He left a message for you." Arlo sat up perfectly straight, all the color draining from his face. Even Victoria stopped sipping her tea. The name Russo was whispered in the high society circles of Chicago with absolute dread. He was the invisible hand that guided the city's underbelly. What was the message? Margaret asked, her voice losing its tyrannical edge. "He said that Kensington Global currently has $200 million in short-term debt maturing next week," Richard replied. "An hour ago, a shell corporation belonging to Russo bought all of it. If you breathe a word to the press about Beatrice, he will call the debt in immediately. He'll trigger a liquidity crisis. He will bankrupt you before lunch. Stay away from her, Margaret. God help you." The line went dead. While the Kensington Empire began to fracture from within 30 miles away, Beatrice woke up in a bed composed of Egyptian cotton and silk down. The storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the St. Regis penthouse. She sat up, realizing her body was sore, but the sharp edges of her panic had dulled into a cold, hard clarity. She wore an oversized silk shirt that smelled faintly of Dominic. She walked out of the bedroom and followed the smell of freshly brewed espresso. In the massive kitchen, Dominic was sitting at a marble island, dressed in a dark tailored suit, reading a tablet. Next to him stood Lorenzo, his imposing underboss. "Good morning," Dominic said, without looking up, though the tension in his shoulders visibly relaxed at the sound of her footsteps. "There is espresso. And food." Beatrice poured a cup, her hand steady. "Did Margaret release the photos?" Dominic finally looked up, his lips curving into a dark, predatory smile. Lorenzo let out a low chuckle. "No," Dominic said. He slid a sleek manila folder across the marble island. "But we found the man who made them, a freelance digital artist in Wicker Park. He was very eager to cooperate once Lorenzo explained the alternative. He signed a sworn affidavit detailing exactly how much Margaret Kensington paid him to superimpose your face onto those images." Beatrice stared at the folder. In one night, Dominic had undone weeks of Margaret's meticulous plotting. But Dominic wasn't finished. "I don't just play defense, Beatrice." Dominic said, his voice dropping into a deadly serious register. "If you strike a king, you must kill him. Or in this case, a queen." He tapped a second file on the counter. "Your husband left you for Victoria Carmichael, because Carmichael Shipping is supposedly worth $1 billion. Margaret wanted a merger of empires. But my forensic accountants spent the night digging through Carmichael's offshore accounts." Dominic stood up, walking around the island to stand in front of Beatrice. "Carmichael Shipping is insolvent. They are drowning in debt, relying on a massive Ponzi scheme of falsified shipping manifests to keep their stock afloat. Victoria isn't marrying Arlo for his charm. She needs the Kensington capital to bail her out before the SEC investigates." Beatrice's eyes widened. "And the baby?" "Ah," Dominic said, his eyes gleaming with ruthless amusement. "Lorenzo tell her about the baby. We pulled her medical records from her private clinic," Lorenzo rumbled. "Arlo Kensington is sterile, a complication from a childhood illness his mother covered up. Victoria is pregnant, all right, by her 24-year-old personal tennis instructor." The sheer magnitude of the betrayal layered upon a mountain of lies hit Beatrice like a physical blow. They had destroyed her for a mirage. Arlo had thrown away 5 years of genuine love for a bankrupt heiress, carrying another man's child, all orchestrated by a mother-in-law who valued power over her son's happiness. "What do you want to do with this?" Dominic asked softly, tapping the files. "I can hand it to the FBI. I can leak it to the Wall Street Journal. Or I can have Lorenzo pay a visit to Arlo." Beatrice looked at the files. Then she looked at the city, sprawling beneath the penthouse windows, the city that the Kensingtons thought they owned. A new, terrifying strength began to bloom in her chest. She had spent 5 years being quiet, being polite, making herself small so Margaret could feel big. No more. She looked up at Dominic, her green eyes blazing with a cold fire that mirrored his own. "Neither," Beatrice said, her voice steady and chillingly calm. "Tomorrow night is the Field Museum Gala. Margaret is planning to use it to publicly announce my infidelity and Arlo's new engagement. They want a public execution." Dominic smiled, a genuine, terrifying expression of pure adoration. "And what do you want, Beatrice?" "I want to go to the gala," she said. "And I want to burn their empire to the ground while they watch." The Field Museum of Natural History was transformed into a glittering palace of excess. Beneath the towering prehistoric shadow of Sioux, the T-Rex, the elite of Chicago society, milled about, drinking vintage Dom Perignon and exchanging venomous whispers. Margaret Kensington stood at the center of the grand hall, radiant in an emerald gown holding court. Arlo stood stiffly beside her, while Victoria Carmichael clung to his arm, a monstrous 6-carat diamond glinting on her finger. The whispers in the room were deafening. Margaret's PR machine had been subtly leaking rumors all day. Beatrice had lost her mind. Beatrice was caught with the staff. Beatrice had been exiled. "It's a tragedy, really," Margaret was saying, sighing dramatically to the wife of the governor. But Arlo's heart was simply too big. He tried to save her from her own base instincts. But some people simply cannot be elevated. Thankfully, Victoria has been his rock through this dark time. The governor's wife nodded sympathetically, though her eyes devoured the scandal. At 9:30 p.m., the string quartet began to play a gentle waltz, signaling the time for the evening's main announcements. Margaret stepped up to a podium, equipped with a microphone, overlooking the sea of Chicago's billionaires, politicians, and socialites. Behind her, a massive digital projector screen displayed the Kensington Global logo. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret's voice echoed through the marble cavern. "Tonight is about looking forward. We shed the burdens of our past to embrace a brighter, stronger future. It brings me immense joy to announce the union of two great houses, my son Arlo and the brilliant Victoria Carmichael." The heavy brass-studded doors of the Field Museum's main entrance suddenly slammed open with a force that echoed like a cannon shot. The string quartet skidded to a halt, producing a horrific screech of bows against strings. 200 heads whipped around. Standing in the entryway, flanked by 12 men in immaculate dark suits, was Beatrice. A collective stunned gasp rippled through the crowd. She did not look like a broken, discarded wife. She wore a custom blood-red Givenchy gown that cascaded around her like liquid fire. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant, razor-sharp style, and her neck was adorned with a necklace of flawless black diamonds that cost more than the Kensington estate. But it wasn't the dress or the diamonds that paralyzed the room. It was the man standing beside her, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. Dominic Rousseau. He wore a bespoke, midnight blue tuxedo. His mere presence in the room caused the oxygen to evaporate. Politicians who had taken his bribes suddenly found their shoes very interesting. Rival CEOs paled. Margaret's jaw dropped. The microphone slipped from her manicured fingers, hitting the podium with a loud screech of feedback. Arlo actually took a step backward, hiding behind Victoria. Beatrice walked down the grand marble staircase. The crowd parted for her, like the Red Sea, terrified of the men flanking her, terrified of the lethal grace with which she moved. "I apologize for the interruption." "Margaret," Beatrice said. She didn't have a microphone, but the absolute silence of the room carried her clear, aristocratic tone to every corner. "But you were talking about shedding the burdens of the past. I couldn't agree more." "Security!" Margaret shrieked, her voice cracking in pure panic. "Gregory, get this woman out of here!" "Gregory is currently eating through a straw, Mrs. Kensington." Lorenzo stepped forward from the shadows, his deep voice rumbling. "I wouldn't call for him." Beatrice stopped 10 feet from the podium. She looked at Arlo. He looked pathetic, small, weak. "You drafted a beautiful story, Margaret," Beatrice said, pulling a small silver flash drive from her clutch. She handed it casually to one of Dominic's men, who walked over to the AV booth. The museum's tech technician took one look at the heavily armed man and scrambled out of the chair. "Let's see the reality," Beatrice whispered. The massive screen behind Margaret flickered. The Kensington Global logo vanished. In its place, an enormous high-resolution document appeared. It was the sworn affidavit from the digital artist, complete with the original photos Margaret had used to create the deepfakes. Beside it, bank transfer receipts showed exact payments from Margaret's personal account to the artist. The society crowd erupted into shocked murmurs. Mayor Harrison stared at Margaret in disgust. "That's a lie!" Margaret screamed, her face purple. "She forged this. She's a hacker." "Scroll," Beatrice commanded softly. The screen shifted. Now a dizzying array of financial documents appeared. It was the internal ledger of Carmichael Shipping. Red ink bled across the screen, detailing the massive fraud, the insolvency, and the SEC investigation that had been quietly opened 2 days ago. Victoria Carmichael let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth, as the billionaires around her began stepping away, realizing the heiress was toxic waste. "You wanted Kensington Capital to save your sinking ships, Victoria," Beatrice said coldly. "But you brought down the very empire you tried to steal." "Arlo!" Victoria cried, grabbing his arm. "Arlo, do something!" But Arlo was staring at the next slide that appeared on the screen. It was a medical document from Northwestern Memorial. Arlo Kensington. Diagnosis: complete infertility. Right next to it was a paternity DNA test pulled from Victoria's private clinic. Father Julian Ramirez. Arlo slowly turned his head to look at Victoria's slightly rounded stomach. You told me it was a miracle," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You said I was going to be a father." "Oh, Arlo," Beatrice said, her voice devoid of any pity. "You gave up everything you had for a woman who was using you as a bank, orchestrated by a mother who views you as a puppet." The sound of heavy boots echoing on the marble floor cut through the chaos. Through the side entrances, men wearing FBI windbreakers began pouring into the gala. Margaret Kensington, Arlo Kensington, Victoria Carmichael. The lead agent barked, flashing a badge. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud." Margaret collapsed against the podium, her knees giving out. 2 agents hauled her to her feet, roughly snapping handcuffs onto her wrists. Arlo didn't even fight. He just stared at the floor as they cuffed him, utterly broken. As they were marched down the center aisle, Margaret locked eyes with Beatrice. There was no hatred left, only the hollow, terrified realization of her own absolute destruction. Beatrice didn't flinch. She watched them walk out into the cold Chicago night, stripped of their wealth, their names, and their freedom. Dominic stepped up beside her, the chaos of the room swirling around them, the reporters screaming questions, the socialites fainting. None of it touched them. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "You burned it down beautifully," Dominic murmured against her ear, his voice dark and possessive. Beatrice leaned back against him, feeling the solid, unyielding strength of the man who had answered her call in the dark. She looked up into his eyes, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "I had a very good teacher," she replied. Dominic chuckled a low sound that vibrated through her chest. "Come, my queen. The show is over. Let's go home." 6 months after the Field Museum Gala, the Chicago skyline remained the same, but the power beneath it had fundamentally shifted. The trial of the Kensington family was the most sensational legal spectacle the city had witnessed in a century. It concluded not with a whimper, but with a resounding crash of the judge's gavel that echoed across every major financial network in the country. Arlo, who had broken down weeping on the witness stand, was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for his complicity in the massive Carmichael shipping fraud. Victoria, completely abandoned by her fair-weather high society friends and stripped of her family's dissolved assets, received 5 years. But Margaret, the ruthless architect of the empire's ruin, was handed a devastating 20-year sentence. The federal judge cited her complete lack of remorse, her extensive witness tampering, and the sheer malice with which she weaponized corporate funds to destroy her own family members. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Beatrice walked through the stark, fluorescent-lit corridors of the Metropolitan Correctional Center. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal pantsuit, her posture impeccable, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of her designer heels echoing off the concrete walls. 2 armed federal guards flanked her, treating her with a level of nervous deference usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. That was the reality of being enveloped by Dominic Russo's invisible, far-reaching influence. She stepped into the high-security visitors' room, a space divided by thick, reinforced plexiglass. Margaret was already seated on the other side. The physical transformation was jarring. The terrifying matriarch who had once commanded boardrooms with a flick of her wrist now looked haggard and hollow. Her posture was severely slumped beneath the heavy, shapeless orange fabric of her prison uniform. Her silver hair, once perfectly coiffed by private stylists, was frizzy graying at the roots and entirely lifeless. Beatrice sat down gracefully and picked up the heavy black telephone receiver. Margaret stared at her through the smudged glass, her eyes burning with a volatile mixture of hatred, humiliation, and absolute exhaustion. Slowly, with a trembling hand, Margaret picked up her end of the line. "Have you come to gloat, Beatrice?" Margaret's voice crackled through the earpiece, raspy, dry, and bitter. "To parade your ill-gotten victory in front of me." "I don't need to gloat, Margaret," Beatrice replied, her voice cool, calm, and perfectly level. "I came to deliver a courtesy message regarding the final liquidation of Kensington Global." Margaret stiffened, a flicker of her old defiance returning. "The state seized the assets. The SEC froze the accounts. It's gone. You get nothing. We both lost." "That is where you are profoundly mistaken," Beatrice said, a faint, predatory smile touching her lips. "When Dominic initiated the liquidity crisis that night, he didn't just buy your short-term debt. He structured the massive buyout through an offshore holding company. When the board of directors was forced into Chapter 11, bankruptcy proceedings last week, they had no choice but to sell the remaining solvent divisions, your real estate, your logistics networks, your intellectual property, for pennies on the dollar to appease their largest creditor." Margaret's eyes widened in dawning horror. Her breath hitched. "No." "Yes," Beatrice confirmed softly. "And yesterday morning, Dominic transferred that holding company entirely into my name. As of this exact moment, I am the majority shareholder and the sole owner of the ashes of your legacy. I have already initiated the corporate restructuring. The Kensington name is being permanently stripped from the skyscrapers as we speak. The board members who enabled you have been fired, stripped of their severance packages. The company will be rebranded under the Aegis umbrella." Margaret dropped her forehead against the plexiglass, a hollow, wretched sob escaping her throat. It was the final, inescapable nail in her coffin. Her legacy was not just ruined, it had been legally conquered, dismantled, and erased by the very woman she had casually thrown out into the rain. "There is one more thing," Beatrice added, her tone dropping into a deadly whisper, forcing Margaret to look back up. "Thomas, the chauffeur you hired to frame me. He didn't just disappear into the wind. I found him 3 days before the trial. I personally offered him $2 million from my new accounts to turn state's evidence and provide the audio recordings of you threatening his life. Dominic provided the necessary muscle to protect him, but I plotted the execution. You didn't just lose to a mafia boss, Margaret. You lost to me." Beatrice didn't wait for a response. She placed the receiver back on the hook, stood up, smoothed her jacket, and walked out without looking back. She left the former Queen of Chicago sobbing silently in a concrete cage. An hour later, Beatrice stepped out of her armored Maybach and walked into the sprawling, marble-floored lobby of the newly minted Aegis International Tower. The heavy scent of fresh paint lingered in the air where the old gilded Kensington logos had been violently torn from the walls. She took the private express elevator to the top floor. When the polished doors slid open, she found Dominic standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling, sunlit city. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, an unlit cigar resting casually between his fingers. As he heard the click of her heels, he turned. The cold, ruthless exterior he presented to the world instantly softened, replaced by a dark, consuming heat reserved only for her. "How was the visit?" Dominic asked, his deep baritone rumbling through the quiet expanse of the penthouse office. "Cathartic," Beatrice answered, walking across the room and stepping naturally into his arms. She rested her hands on his broad chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the fine silk of his shirt. "The past is finally buried. It's done." Dominic reached up his large, calloused thumb, gently tracing the delicate line of her jaw. "You have your empire now, Beatrice. You hold the keys to the city's legitimate corporate channels, while I control the shadows beneath them. There is no one left to challenge us." "I never wanted an empire," Beatrice murmured, looking up into his mesmerizing eyes. "I only ever wanted what was fair. But I've learned that in this city, fairness is a luxury only the powerful can afford, and you are the most powerful woman in Chicago," Dominic whispered, leaning down to press a slow, deeply possessive kiss to her lips. It was a silent promise sealed in fire and steel, an unbreakable vow forged in the crucible of their shared enemies. They stood together, silhouetted against the glittering, endless skyline. 5 years ago, a bleeding criminal in a dark alleyway and a desperate trauma nurse had formed a dangerous, unlikely bond. Today, the King and Queen of Chicago surveyed their conquered kingdom, united by blood, tested by betrayal, and bound by an absolute, terrifying devotion. Did you love this story of ultimate revenge power and dark romance? The fall of the Kensington Empire is just the beginning. If Beatrice and Dominic's ruthless rise to the top kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share this video with your fellow drama lovers. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming thrilling stories. What would you have done if you were in Beatrice's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Stay tuned for more epic tales.